Ever work on a game for so long, put years of hard-earned effort and sweat into it, dreamt of it going big, earning great reviews, tons of sales, so much that you could earn millions of dollars, buy a yacht, sail off into the distance, and drink pina coladas for the rest of your days? Well, I did too, and let me tell you, while I didn't buy a yacht, I did learn a few lessons along the way, and things that I might do differently next time around. The game I'm talking about is called Spectro. It's a VR ghost-busting roguelike that took me about 5 years to make. Now when I released it, it got some pretty good reviews, but didn't exactly set the sales charts on fire. And that's okay, because it was my first commercial game. And the next time around, here are some things I would do differently. Lesson number 1, don't overscope. This is probably the biggest single piece of advice that you should pay attention to when you're starting your next game or any project really. What you need to do is figure out how much time you have to spend on the project, what your resources are, whether that's financial or the size of your team, and from there you can scope your project. Now scope is kind of a fancier way of saying the overall size or complexity of the project. Now the reason I started Spectro was because I had actually just won a pretty large sum of money in a VR competition. I released an experience called the Night Cafe. That's something I can talk about in another video. But that gave me enough money to support myself for 2 years living in Brooklyn, which is where I was living at the time. That was kind of my goal with Spectro, to spend 2 years working on it and then release it to the market. So the game ended up taking me 5 years to release. And the reason for that is because I didn't properly scope up front. Now, I had way too many unknowns going into the project, and that should have been kind of a red flag that I needed to figure out exactly what I should focus on. So for Spectro, I wanted a procedural level generation system. I wanted to explore an entirely new genre that hadn't existed before. I wanted to make procedural music, advanced enemy AI, and even use controls that hadn't been released to the market yet. So with all those sort of complex unknowns, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into as far as development time went. To top it off, during development, I actually continued to add more features because I thought of new ideas, which is okay. You should be flexible with your development and consider adding new features. But if you're going to do that, you have to really be honest with how long is that going to take you, and should you maybe compensate by removing other features that you had already planned? Because otherwise, this is something called feature creep or scope creep, which is when the size of your project balloons out of control, and before you know it, you're doubling or tripling your development time. So my big takeaway here is to use constraints in order to control the size of your project and to keep on track with your schedule. Now in Spectro, there was a number of areas where I could have simplified things. The procedural music, I could have used traditionally composed music, and that would have been much faster, or even found music that was already available online. Even for the procedural level generation, which I thought was so important to the game because I was making a roguelike, but in hindsight, I might have been able to simplify that pretty drastically, or even make handcrafted levels and just make a bunch of them and randomize which ones are selected. That could have even made for more interesting levels than what the procedural generation engine I designed would output. So there's a number of areas you can look at to maybe simplify, and one of the best ways to figure out if these creative solutions will work is to test them. And that gets me to my next point, which is prototyping is incredibly important. I made a couple of early prototypes during development, but I quickly realized that in order to really test this game, I was going to need to have a lot of pretty complex systems ready to go. And right away, that should have been kind of a red flag to say, maybe come up with something a little simpler that can be tested and in a prototype, and find the fun and the core mechanic through prototyping. But because I was relying on all these complex systems like procedural generation, AI enemy behavior, and even some other mechanics that I felt like I needed, like the shooting mechanics. Some of those maybe would be good candidates for prototyping, but others just had too much complexity to really prototype efficiently or effectively. So I think my main takeaway as far as prototyping goes is try to find the fun in the prototype phase, and if you can't, see if there's a way to simplify the game until you can. Which kind of leads into the next lesson, which is playtest early and often. Like I said, I didn't really have playable builds for a while, so I was limited in how I could playtest and who I could playtest with. Instead, I basically waited until I released the early access version to do a lot of my playtesting. And that was really kind of too late because that was 4 years into development. And while I did playtest a little bit before that with some friends and family, I wish I had done a little bit more. There was one experience that actually went pretty well. I joined an event in New York City. It was called Play NYC, and it was their Halloween event. It was a lot of fun. I brought my giant desktop workstation over to this venue for the event. And of course, here's another little tip. Don't forget your power cable, because I brought my whole rig over, showed up, set everything up, didn't have a power cable, had to go all the way back home and back, wasted like 2 hours of the event. But in the end, I got really valuable feedback. It really taught me a lot about the game and what needed to be worked on. More specifically, there was an issue with players understanding what the mechanics were. And so I really had to figure out how to tutorialize a lot of the gameplay mechanics and how to pace that out in the game. I actually heard that Blizzard, during the development of Warcraft 2 way back in the day, they would have a playable build every single night. So it didn't matter what they were working on, they had to make sure the game was playable in some state every single night. And so they would run nightly playtests with the team. One of the things they had going for them is they didn't really rely on AI for testing because they could just play competitively with each other. This brings me to my next point, which is don't rely on AI for fun gameplay. There are plenty of games that do rely on AI to create the full experience of the game. I think of games like Alien Isolation or almost any shooter that has a single player campaign. You really need that AI to get a sense of what the gameplay actually is going to be like. But for smaller teams, maybe solo developers or 1 or 2 person teams, you really want to focus in on a gameplay type that won't require this advanced level of AI. Unless that's really what you want to do and that's what you want to focus on. Now, when I was developing Spectro, I probably spent more than half the time just creating the AI. And although in the end, I'm really proud of the result, there was a lot of false starts. There was at one point I had to completely scrap everything and start from scratch. And it just was a really long learning process to figure it out, to develop it, to get it working. And not just to get it working, but to get it to be somewhat fun and challenging for the player. Lesson number 5, market your game early and often. And don't just market the way you think you're supposed to, trying to sound like some big corporation or something. You know, really humanize your marketing. And I speak from my experience developing Spectro for the most part as a solo developer. And I was always trying to market the game as if it was coming from some big, team or publisher. But I think ultimately I would have had more success with my marketing if I came from the perspective of a solo developer. Really be more of myself and be more honest and open about it rather than pretending to be someone I'm not. Just be honest, be open, and try different things, because I struggled with knowing what I should put out there for marketing early on, because I didn't have a lot of gameplay to show. I didn't even have a lot of artwork to show early on because I was so tech heavy in the early phase. You got to find something to put out there, whether it's behind the scenes videos with devlogs or early sketches and artwork, or just talking about what you want to do with the game. All those things are better than nothing. And at the very least, try some things and devote some of your time to that marketing effort. Don't just think you should spend 100% of your time on building the game. At least set aside 10, 15% of that time to just focus on marketing and getting the word out there on it from the very beginning. Because I think with fewer resources, you need to spread that out over time. And you might as well get started early. Marketing is a way of market testing as well. Because as you put out marketing material, you'll be able to gauge the response through various analytics, whether it's how many people subscribe based on the content you put out, or you can see how many people view the content if it's on YouTube or something like that. And when you have that information, you can start to get a sense of if people are responding to the game positively, if they're interested in engaging with it more. And that can be a good clue as to whether your game as a whole is tapping into the right market or whether you might need to pivot a little bit. Which brings me to my next point, which is spend time doing marketing research. Really consider what's out there on the market. What's selling? Are there games that would be competition to your game? And if not, why not? And if there are games similar to yours, is there some way you can differentiate it from that other game? Can you put a twist on it? Can you do something better than what that other game or games are doing? And that's really important because you do need to have that unique selling proposition. And that's something that I don't think I focused on a lot when I was first coming up with the idea for the game. In fact, my original idea for the game was a hidden object game mixed with a sort of roguelike action game. Now, those are two different genres, and on their own, they're each kind of niche genres. And when you combine them, it may actually not have a lot of crossover audience left over, which is something that I think happened with Spectro. And going forward, I would want to make sure I did enough market research to get a sense of what other games are out there. Are there similar-ish games that are selling? Because if not, that could be a problem, unless you really think that you're onto an entirely new genre and you really believe in that, which is okay too, but you should really know that going into development. Because a lot of us have many different game ideas before we decide to start developing one. And it can be tricky to know which one to pick, and that market research can really help you hone in and pick that idea that's right for you to work on for the next year, 2 years, or 5 years. So that brings me to the next point, which is pick an idea that you truly believe in. Now, with all that market research, it can sound like this is kind of at odds with that idea, but at a certain point, you have to really say, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on this. If you just rely on it being something that you believe will sell a lot of copies, and it's more of a product that you want to put out rather than a project that you believe in and is maybe an expression of ideas and beliefs and even art that you want to put out into the world, well, there's some kind of balance there. But if you don't have some belief in the project and you don't really feel strongly about it, then the long days and weeks and months, even years of time developing this game will be really difficult to get through unless you have a strong sense of purpose about the game itself. That's one of the things that's probably one of the hardest things for me to admit about Spectro, is that it never was something that I really feel like was an expression of something I felt strongly about. I thought it was a cool idea initially, but that wasn't really enough at a certain point. But I just wanted to say that while Spectro didn't perform sales-wise as well as I would have hoped, it still was a success for me in many ways. I'm very proud of it as a game, and I think there are a lot of fun aspects to the game. But given more time, sure, I could have polished it even more, but at a certain point, I had to move on from it. I learned so many skills during the development that I actually got hired for a lot of those skills. So that brings me to the final bonus lesson. Consider working with a team. I did work with a couple freelancers for some of the 3D models. That was really helpful. It did speed up development. If I had more money to invest in the game, I might have considered doing more of that. But really, I probably should have thought earlier on about a partnership with another developer or two. And really, in hindsight, I feel like I might have been a little too controlling of the game idea, or a little too stingy with wanting to share revenue or this or that, imagining, hey, I can release this and, take all the profits instead of splitting it. But in reality, if you have more people working on something, there's a bigger chance that it could succeed potentially. That's not the case every time. And so I don't want to say, solo development should never be done or anything. In fact, I plan on probably developing some smaller solo projects still. But if you're gonna develop a project that's bigger in scope, consider partnering with other people for that project. So thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments whether any of these lessons resonated with you, or maybe if you have some of your own advice to share as well. Now I'm making all of the lessons available in a simple downloadable cheat sheet. You can get that in the link in the description below. And feel free to check out our next video where we're gonna be discussing more game dev topics. We'll see you there. Bye.